Hello, my name's Roisin, and I'm sick of reading. Earlier this week, I saw on Ariel Bissett's channel that she read one of the essays that she wrote during her undergraduate degree or master's, I'm not sure which one, and it was her favourite essay that she'd ever written. It was called The Time-Travelling Typewriter. It was very good. You should go watch it. I would have linked it in the cards. So I thought I would read my favourite essay. I've talked on here before about translations of the Odyssey and how I was going to make a video about different translations of the Odyssey. I might still make that video, but this essay is about Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. This is the first translation of the Odyssey into English by a woman, but it has been translated into other languages before. It's been translated into Italian and into French by women, other modern languages, I mean. And also the other thing that I did want to mention was that when I was watching Ariel's video, she, in her introduction, says, "In this essay I will," and it just reminded me so much of when I was studying myself in Canada and how they told us that that's like the done thing there in academic circles. When you're doing your introduction, you kind of set it up in that way and you talk about it that way. And it's how difficult that was for me to do, because it's so different from the UK, where I have been trained since I was 16 that you never, ever use the word I in an essay, at least in the humanities. I can't speak more broadly than that, but in the humanities and in English literature, you do not use the word I, so our sentences are a little more convoluted. Just the way that the style of academics is, you're not supposed to talk that way. So I just thought it was interesting because it just reminded me of when I studied in Canada. This essay I wrote as part of my master's in creative writing, and it was an essay that was supposed to be an academic essay that related in some way to the work which I was doing. So in this essay, I do use I and talk about my own work briefly, because I had to link it somehow to my work. My work that I did for my master's was retellings of Ovid's Metamorphoses from a modern feminist perspective. I will get into the essay now. This essay is 5,000 words, so I'm not sure how long this video will be, but... Last year, Emily Wilson published the first translation of the Odyssey into English by a woman. What effect, if any, do her gender and the time of publishing have on the translation? Now, by last year, I mean 2017. In November 2017, Emily Wilson published a translation of the Odyssey. Although women have translated this poem into French and Italian in the 17th century, this is the first version to have been published in English. This work has been the source of much discussion in the classics world and wider media due to the landmark it represents. Despite it being a surprise to some that it has taken over 400 years for this to happen, there have been many people asking why it matters. They suggest that we should judge a translation on its merits and ignore the person of the translator altogether. Indeed, in translation studies, the idea of looking at the ideology and person of the translator and the effect that this has on the work is a relatively recent phenomenon, with the most important works on the topic being published in the last 2 decades. Much of this argument seems to stem from the idea that a translator should make their work as invisible as possible, and that faithfulness to the original is the only measure through which a work can be judged. This idea of faithfulness seems to me to be misguided. All translation is a work of adaptation. It is not merely searching for the words in a dictionary like an undergraduate translating lines for a tutor, but involves translating the feeling and meaning as it would have been received by the original audience in a way that allows the new audience to appreciate it. It is true, too, that the concept of their gender is not something that is mentioned when it comes to the historically male translators, and perhaps this is the benefit of being one amongst many instead of one alone. However, there are some aspects of the work that have come from Wilson's not only being a woman, but also the youngest person in over 50 years to translate the poem, and therefore the most modern translator of the Odyssey. For example, Wilson is the first to use the word slave to refer to the domestic workers throughout the poem, who have previously been referred to as maids, or with a description of their work. The fact this has not been seen before is almost shocking. Some question why, when we have so many translations of the same work, a new one is relevant at all. However, the act of reading is not merely formed by the work itself, a one-way road in which the reader is a recipient of information, but is instead a process of adaptation, illumination, and understanding, informed as much by the context in which it is read as by the context in which it is written. In order to understand the question of why Wilson's gender matters in her translation, we must first understand that Greek myths are still relevant today and what modern interpretations can offer us. If we understand that, we can see that a fresh interpretation may offer us that which we have not yet considered, bringing to light aspects which have been ignored when all translations previously have come from a similar perspective of the white Western upper-class male. For myself, this is an important question because I write interpretations of Greco-Roman myths using the source material from the Metamorphoses by Ovid from a modern feminist perspective. The myths themselves are well-trodden ground, used in art and literature for centuries, and still in use today. It has been pointed out to me that this is a crowded field. However, this does not mean, I think, that there is no room for more. As the questions I mentioned are asked of Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, why do we need more interpretations and what does gender matter, so too are these questions I consider in regards to my work. For me, there are obvious answers to these questions, both regarding my work and this new translation. It is true there are thousands of works translating or interacting with classical texts, with what are considered two of the significant foundational texts of Western literature with which both I and Wilson are engaging, but the vast majority of these texts come from a specific perspective. Classics up until the early 20th century was closely associated with elite institutions and symbolised a particular kind of cultural and political power, one which it was believed should not be shared with women. Although, of course, that has relaxed somewhat, the fact that November 2017 marked the publication of the first translation of the Odyssey into English by a woman goes to show that there is still a way to go. Moreover, there has been much engagement with classical mythology in modern poetry by women, clearly, for example, with Anne Carson and Carol Ann Duffy, as well as a host of others. However, I still feel there is both a question of elitism, as well as the fact that much of what has been interpreted is through an older lens of second-wave feminism, which informs but is not concurrent with my own belief and that of many modern writers. Greek myths are perfect for this reinterpretation because they are archetypes and are so well known, but also because the culture in which they emerged is so different and so much of what remains is in fragments. This means that the myths are simultaneously foreign and central. The changes allow us to read again that which was familiar, and to understand what is different, what is being drawn out, and what alters from what was seen before. It is precisely because the road is so well travelled that that which is new becomes almost more subversive. It is also therefore always relevant, as we can see from the new vantage point and new hues in the story informed by our perspective. As Emily Wilson commented, in the past when she had read the Odyssey, it had not been for her a story of refugees and foreign people in a new land, but with our current political context, something new arose. Emily Wilson, when speaking of some of the criticism of her new translation from classic scholars, has described it as a digging in of heels, and saying that she partly just wants to shake them and make them see that all translations are interpretations. I think this is a key point in understanding why a new translation is valuable and what Emily Wilson as a young female scholar can bring to the table. Some commentators have derided Wilson's work as bringing the Odyssey to the North America of modern social justice warrior and comparing her provocative approach to male translators who immerse themselves in the text to live it, breathe it, and press it for meaning. What they're doing instead is seeing what is new as interpretation, and ignoring the implicit biases and interpretive choices that have gone into the translations that came before, because they are received wisdom. Wilson herself points out that the translations with which they first encountered the Odyssey and other texts colours the way those texts are discussed, even by scholars who have read the Greek. Their choices are within the status quo, and so they are more invisible. However, even what is chosen in the dictionary lexicon is an interpretive choice, one which reinforces inherent structures in our society. Ancient Greek is a language very unlike our own, both in terms of vocabulary and syntax, and so a direct word-for-word translation is not possible, especially if you wish to retain the poetic form or meaning which will resonate with readers today. Homeric Greek is especially difficult, a mixture of different dialects which would not have been spoken even by the original audience. Languages function differently, and so much of translation is achieving a similar effect through different means. There is still an idea for some that translation should be as faithful as possible, and often that means adhering to the old ideas of the study of classics, which is an elitist male domain. Translations are often compared to the essay written by Matthew Arnold, in which he says there are four main important factors when translating Homer: to focus on plainness, simplicity, directness of thought, and nobility. Although, of course, what these four things mean is still up for interpretation. This list was written in 1862, and yet is still a standard to which we hold translation, and it seems to have to do with a certain idea of class and aesthetics, and the idea of conflating being epic and being ancient that is part of the boys' club of classics and the translation thereof. The most precise case of political interpretive difference in Emily Wilson's translation compared to those who came before is the word slaves. Wilson is the first translation in which this word is used continually throughout the text. For example, in the case of Eurycleia, the slave who looked after Telemachus as a child and who now performs various household tasks. In the highly praised translation of Fagles and Fitzgerald, she is alternately called a chambermaid and a nurse. The Greek is not at all ambivalent about her position. She is owned by her master, and words for slave are used throughout the Greek text. This is so clear that other translators would have to actively choose to obscure the fact that the hero of the poem is a man who owns slaves. Wilson complicates that which earlier translations have made more straightforward. It is not just Odysseus's character which is complicated through this means, but also Penelope, a favourite character of second-wave feminist classicists, whom Wilson translates as having listened warily and now she spoke to scold the slave. The power dynamics are not obscured, and the life of the non-elite characters in the poem brought more directly to light by an interpretation that, it could be argued, is more faithful to the original poem. In this way, we can see that all of the translations are a form of interpretation, and choices are made that come not just from sticking closely to the literal meaning of the text. A translation is not an attempt to get as close as possible to an elusive, real meaning, and so the influence of different perspectives can only enhance our understanding. Wilson is not politicising a piece of previously neutral literature. She is bringing to light what is inherent in the original piece. She is pressing it for meaning. In interviews relating to this release of this translation, Wilson has spoken out about classics as being a boys' club. She said she felt isolated from just the fact of never having a female teacher, but it's a difference to how you feel when you don't have any mentors who even know what it would be like. The same is true for people of colour in the classics world. White male academics have for many years dominated classics. This ties into the idea of realising that the work of translation involves interpretation, and to what new pieces can show us. The work of Wilson is for this new era, and disrupts the received wisdom about the interpretation and exposes centuries of masculinist readings. This can be seen in the section of the poem in which Telemachus goes into the home of Menelaus and speaks to Helen. In this scene, Helen refers to herself as Kinopis, the literal meaning of which is dog-faced or dog-eyed. Wilson's translation of this in comparison to those translations which have come before has been the subject of much debate. The line from the poem is, "The Achaeans came to try on account of dog-eyed me, contemplating ferocious war." However, the epithet dog-eyed is not one that makes sense to a modern audience, and so scholars have to puzzle out how to translate it, so the meaning comes through. A standard lexicon translates it as shameless, and it is used throughout the poem to refer mostly to women, often those who have committed adultery, including for the goddess Aphrodite, Agamemnon's wife and murderess Clytemnestra, and the slave girl Melanthe, called a dog by both Odysseus and Penelope. However, it is not solely a term used for women. Odysseus calls the suitors dogs for their behaviour in his home, and suggests a hungry human stomach is dog-like. However, the word is translated by Samuel Butler as "my most shameless self," by Robert Fagles as "shameless whore," by Richard Latimer as "shameless me," and by Mendelssohn as "shameless bitch." Wilson, however, takes a different path. "They made my face the cause that hounded them." She keeps the part of the word that specifies her face and removes the pejorative. There is, Jung In Chai argues, much room for interpretation in the Greek. It is not only an insult. Wilson agrees with this argument in her own translator's note, stating that the connotation of Kinopis is not malice or cruelty, but instead is about drive and a position below that of people, but with the power to overthrow the order of things. This, she says, is why bitch, being an insult directed specifically at women, is a misleading translation. Whore even more so. There is nothing, argues Wilson, about sexual misconduct in these lines. Helen says the Greeks made war for the sake of her face, but does not blame the war on herself. Instead, she is self-possessed and cheerful. Scholars such as Daniel Mendelssohn and Helen Morales disagree with Wilson's interpretation. Mendelssohn states in his book that it is important that Helen both blames herself and is lying about her feelings of guilt, in contrast to Wilson's description, and so he translates shameless bitch, implying that her actions are in part to blame. Morales states that in using hounded, Wilson has kept the dog element, but changes the sexual politics in a way that is hard to align with the Greek, and also accuses Wilson of writing out female sexual desire and removing Helen's agency. It is important to note that there is ambiguity here. The word Kinopis has multiple interpretations, and so it is possible that there is more than one viable translation. However, what Wilson offers us is an interpretation that does not exist elsewhere. There are other examples of the possible interpolation of our sexual politics being added into the text when enough sexism already exists, and Wilson here shows us that perhaps that is not necessary. This is why new perspectives are valuable in such a malleable arena. Helen has not had her agency removed, but instead a sense of shame that was present in the earlier translation no longer exists. It allows us to consider the idea of blame in a way which our interpretations, due to their perspectives, do not allow. It reveals new layers, Emily Wilson says in her interview with the New York Times, "If you're going to admit that stories matter, then it matters how we tell them, and that exists on the level of microscopic word choice, as well as on the level of which story you're going to pick to start off with, and then, what exactly is that story? The whole question of what is that story is going to depend on the language and words you use." The language that Wilson uses is what makes her version revolutionary. The very first stanza of the poem sets up what she is doing. "Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times." Her modernisation of this ancient poem and the plain contemporary language she uses opens up the closed and elite world of the poem and invites in people who do not have a classical education. Wilson is not just a scholar writing a translation, however. She is also a technically skilled poet, writing the epic poem in iambic pentameter to give a feeling of storytelling. It is the metre that most of us in the English-speaking world are familiar with, and feels like a natural rhythm for us to read. The other recent translations do not have such regularity, or, as Lattimore, attempted to follow the dactylic hexameter of the Greek in a way which feels ungainly in the modern reader's mouth. Wilson also avoids the archaisms and grandeur that other scholars have used in the past. Many of the translations have used language similar to that of 19th century Romantic poets, despite it being no closer to the Greek than our own language. Her writing has been praised for its straightforward and radically readable quality. This is part of the clearing away of the elitism of the study. There is no need for hark or thou, Homer did not use such words, but the pomposity and epic quality of other translations invite a certain kind of praise, and again reflect the received wisdom of what is the done thing. Wilson is shaking things up. She also doesn't avoid colloquialisms, using terms like fight solo and many canapes. These changes are considered daring among classicists and have been criticised by scholars who claim the Greek doesn't strictly support them, and are saying Telemachus was showing initiative, a little report card-ish and entirely modern. However, the canapes appear during a wedding, and while not strictly Greek, allow a modern reader to understand the context of what is going on. The Greek may not strictly support her choices, but it does allow for them. Some argue that the old oral bardic poetry which makes up the Odyssey, a language which was already strange to the original audience, means that a similar bardic style is better suited for our modern times. We should reflect our own oral poetic tradition. That is one possible interpretation. One way to get across the feeling which the poem would have given its original audiences. Wilson chooses instead to foreground other ideas. Perhaps a poem that is not as clean as Wilson's would mean a focus on more style than substance. Wilson allows us to get into the subtleties of the poem by stripping down the trappings of style. One of the more controversial of Wilson's modernisms is that of the first line, "Tell me about a complicated man." The word she has translated as complicated is polytropos. This word has caused trouble for all those who translate the poem, because there is no direct equivalent, and so an alternative that gets to the meaning is needed. The word means much turning or many turns, but neither of these things gets across the sense in a way that is comprehensible to modern readers. They do not feel like something someone would say. Robert Fagles describes Odysseus as being of twists and turns. Mendelssohn uses the adjective twisty. Fitzgerald has "that man skilled in all ways of contending," and Lattimore of many ways. These are only the more recent of translations. In all 60 versions since the early 17th century, there have been nearly 60 different translations, extended from prudent and resourceful to tossed by fate. This is the problem with the word polytropos. It's complicated. The word is about Odysseus both internally and externally. He is a man who has many different facets of personality and many different resources to call on. He is also a man who is lost and has been buffeted across the eastern Mediterranean by foul winds and bad-tempered gods. It was also, unlike a lot of the Odyssey, a word well known to the contemporary audience. It was Attic Greek, and part of everyday parlance. Wilson has been criticised for a word that seems at first glance too simple to convey the full sense of polytropos. Mendelssohn, Wilson's closest contemporary, whose translation comes as part of his memoir of his father, tweeted that he would rather preserve the fullest sense possible of polytropos, which he doesn't think complicated does. He feels that complicated doesn't do justice to the Greek, which suggests both mentality and directionality. Madeline Miller, an American novelist who has herself written adaptations of the Iliad, comments that Wilson's version has an inviting punch and appeals to our modern sensibility by focusing on Odysseus' eternal state, but to achieve that effect, she has to bend away from the word's other layers. However, in Mendelssohn's attempt to preserve the fullest sense possible, he has used the phrase, "the twisty one who wandered widely." Twisty is not a word that used today to describe situations or people, and it is not metaphorically resonant. It also does not give any sense of his state of mind. This shows how hard it is for a translator to get the meaning of a word with no direct analogue. Helen Morales, whose review criticised the political aspect of Wilson's translation, also claims that complicated is the vocabulary of a woman in a bar talking to her pal about a boyfriend whom she should have dumped a long time ago. However, it is much more than that. Although complicated is modern and immediately resonant with the audience of today, it also tells us right away that this is not going to be a straightforward reading. He is not a clear hero or one with clear motives. There is something to be on the watch for with this character. Wilson has in many ways complicated this translation and allowed for the ambiguities in the text. The more direct translations of others do not invite engagement with the text in the same way. In addition to that, the etymology of the word complicated adds depth to what seems on the surface so modern and plain. From the Latin verb complicare, it means to fold together, to twist. Although this does not come to our minds when we first read the word, it is another hint of the layers in both Odysseus the man and the telling of his tale. The other question that gets asked of Emily Wilson's translation is, does it matter that she's a woman? Yes, there are many differences between her translation and others, but are these down to her gender? Some critics wish to ignore the idea of her being a woman altogether, suggesting that it is irrelevant to the question of the quality of her translation. Although it is true that not all the changes can be solely ascribed to her gender, there is something to be said that despite 60 men having a go at translating the poem, none have come up with these changes. She is a qualified and impressive academic, and a skilled translator and poet, but there is more to it than that. Her translation allows for a more nuanced look at the gender dynamics in the poem. Morales criticised Wilson for not using man as the first word in her poem, as andra is in the Greek, because she argues that the poem is about what it means to be a man. That grossly oversimplifies the gender dynamics and themes of the poem, gender dynamics that Wilson is the first to explore in such depth. Her translation lays bare some of the inequalities between characters that other translations have elided. For Wilson, the meaning of the poem is not what it means to be a man, but the question of who matters. She also describes the act of translation as a woman as an act of intimate alienation. Although gender is not the sum of what Wilson offers to this new translation, and indeed she did not know she would be the first woman to translate it, it is hard to say it does not matter at all. The classics were, and to some extent still are, an elite institution, a way of expressing power that was considered to be masculine. Women were denied access. So though some argue that Wilson is over-politicising her translation, and it is this that makes the changes where her gender alone would not have done, there is still this aspect of distance and discomfort that allows female translators and adapters to see from a different vantage point than men. Further, the Odyssey especially adds to this sense of strangeness because of its place in the canon and as a foundational text of Western literature which for centuries was considered to belong to men. Women not being so embedded in this tradition allows them, as Wilson has done, to subvert the canon, to bring to light aspects which have long been ignored but which are readable in the original. In an article of The Guardian, Wilson says that male translators write with a confident exuberance, often expanding or adding to the original. Female classical translators have tended to approach the original more gingerly, with more careful discipline. This can be seen in Wilson's work as the only translator to stick to the same number of lines as in the original, and to have given herself a strict metrical beat so often avoided by modern male translators. Female translators cannot place themselves so comfortably within the world of the story, cannot so readily identify with the hero, and so perhaps are in a position to be more critical. One small example of this is when translating how Odysseus lost all of the men who have travelled back with him from Troy. Fagles translates, "He could not save them from disaster." Chapman has, "But so their fates he could not overcome." The literal translation is, "Even so he did not protect his companions." The male translators have changed "to do" into "to be able to," taking the blame from Odysseus. But for Wilson, he failed to keep them safe. Again, her translation is more faithful to the original in this way, and it is the presuppositions of the other translators that has led to a different meaning. The most gratuitous moment of the male translator's presupposition altering the poem's depiction of gender comes in Book 22 of the poem. Odysseus orders Telemachus to execute 12 slave girls for the things they did with the suitors. It is an honour killing. These women are described in the Greek as dmoiai, a word which means domestic female slave. Wilson is the only translator to use the word slave, and to indicate to us how young this kind of domestic worker would have been, calling them these girls. Lattimore calls them faithless maids, and has Telemachus call them creatures. Fagel has maidservants. The fact that these women would have been very young and were slaves with no power to resist or to consent to the acts for which they are punished is completely wiped out by the male translators. We are invited to see their punishment as ethical. These women have betrayed Odysseus, and so in this world would be executed. The misogyny of the translation goes further than this, however. Robert Fagles, whose translation was praised for his sympathetic treatment of the female characters, has Telemachus call the slaves sluts and the suitors whores. This is repeated throughout male translations, but there is no pseudo-moral invective in the Greek. They are described as slaves, and the feminine article is used. Though Telemachus does explain that he wishes to kill them because they lay with the suitors, the word used in previous translations suggests that what they did was immoral and done by their own volition. The punishment is something they brought on themselves. In contrast, Wilson translates, "They will forget the things the suitors made them do with them in secret." Also, she calls them girls. She is bringing back the humanity that Lattimore, with the use of creatures, takes from them, and allowing the reader to see the power dynamics inherent in the poem. This is a way that Wilson, as a woman, has diverged from the male consensus, but again is sticking closer to the Greek. Translators' presuppositions and interpretations enter their reading of the text even without being aware of it, and in this case, they have interpolated a judgment and misogyny which is entirely modern. Regardless of whether you think gender has anything to do with translation, this is still a landmark feat and a remarkable retranslation of a 2,700-year-old poem. The words are fresh and modern, and the metre and brevity of it bring a sense of immediacy and pace to an epic poem which has, in past offerings, tended to drag. However, there is more to it than that. Many of the choices that Wilson has made highlight things that have been obscured or glanced over in the past. The very readability of the poem is in some ways a political act. Wilson is taking a canonical, foundational piece of literature, part of the Western tradition which has for too long belonged to elite white men, and has opened it up for a new generation and a new audience. The updated language and strength of the storytelling make this accessible to those who have been purposefully excluded before. And there is still more to it than that. Although men have had 400 years to make similar choices to the ones Wilson has, to allow us to see the slavery in the text, to read the complicated nature of Odysseus's heroism, this is the first translation to have done so. In making the changes she has, removing sexist insults like bitch and whore, which are not faithful to the Greek but instead inserted by a modern sensibility, Wilson allows us to see the interpretive choices made by those who came before her. It also allows us to see the true inequalities of power and choice within the poem, to contrast Odysseus's many wanderings with Penelope's entrapment, to see that the hero of this poem owned other people. Maybe this is not because of Wilson's gender, but considering the distance with which even white women have had to approach the classics, and the originality of these changes, it seems hard to argue it has nothing to do with it. So that is the end of my essay. If you have anything you'd like to comment or engage with, let me know in the comments down below. And if you post your own essays, please link it to me so I can have a look. I've linked the PDF in the description, so if you want to go and check out my sources or have a look around, that will be there for you. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.